Good evening. It seems to me that restoring the correct chronology, the correct history, is directly connected to understanding what is happening today, how history actually unfolded, how culture developed, how languages evolved, how economies grew, and so on. After all, as you may recall, in our reconstruction there are no dark ages, no mysterious cycles, no passionarity, no dropping out of entire chunks of human history during which, according to the traditional history, it is unclear what happened or how cultural and civilizational continuity was maintained. Moreover, based on traditional views of supposed dark ages and cyclical patterns, all sorts of bizarre theories arise, claiming that our own modern culture is destined to cycle, to decline, to undergo some sort of collapse, to end in nuclear war or other catastrophes. We believe that the new chronology carries a deeply humanistic and creative potential, because it maintains that development has been continuous, steady, and permanently on the rise.
We'll start sorting all this out in a moment, but first ask our first interactive question.
It even has some connection to the topic. I'd like to ask the following question. Dear viewers, do you understand what is happening right now in Yugoslavia?
Now, let me ask you this. Our broadcasts are about history. Yugoslavia is a current event. Why did you suddenly decide to ask about Yugoslavia?
Andrei, even as contemporaries, direct witnesses of certain events, thankfully not participants, I'd still like to know, can we truly understand what is happening there? Are we even capable of interpreting it correctly?
Actually, I think this is an excellent question, because if you watch CNN and then watch the Russian newscast, Time, about Yugoslavia, you get the impression that they're covering two completely different events, when in fact it's the very same one. Which means we are now turning to the subject of sources, where information comes from, including historical information. The question of primary sources. So, I want to ask you something very specific to start with. For example, let's take Homer's Iliad. Is there actually something that says, Homer, the Iliad, or has it already been reconstructed in some way? I use the Iliad here simply as an example.
Andrei, in principle, we could attempt to define what is meant by primary sources in the way historical science understands them, rather than only in our own understanding. Primary sources are called certain manuscripts, documents, texts. The form doesn't matter, in regard to which someone at some point declared, "This is a primary source." In other words, there were specific individuals who were the first to say so. Or else, as a result of some sort of consensus among a very small circle of scholars, it was decided that this particular item is a primary source. I should note that this question turns out to be anything but idle. As archives are opened, new primary sources appear that are very difficult to interpret in any straightforward way. They are either not publicized or kept quiet. Let me give you an example.
About Homer.
Here's the situation with Homer.
Is there an actual manuscript with his name on it?
There is no manuscript. There is a printed edition, traditionally dated to the early 15th century. According to traditional history, the first edition of Homer, through which Europe became acquainted with these remarkable works, was published in the early 15th century.
How were they preserved? What existed before that?
The story of the Iliad and the Odyssey is, I would say, full of contradictions. Traditional history maintains that, being blind, Homer didn't write his works down himself, but sang them. After he composed these texts, about 700 pages in today's compact print, he performed them orally. These texts were memorized word for word, supposedly for about 300 to 400 years.
But think about it. Are we to believe that for 400 years people transmitted the Iliad and the Odyssey orally, with absolute accuracy?
Down to the very last punctuation mark, apparently.
But to me that seems impossible. Logically, it simply cannot be.
Indeed, technically it's very hard to imagine, since in real life each storyteller adds something of his own or takes certain liberties, interpretations, and so forth. It's not hard to guess what distortions might arise over a period as long as 300 to 400 years.
Let's get back to this in a moment, because it's interesting to see what the new chronology thinks about it. But first, a question. Someone has been eager to speak for a long time. Please, go ahead.
What do you think of the version that the Mongol yoke came not from the east, but from the west? Val Yansky gives such arguments as, for example, the words, orda and orden, horde and order, having the same root. For instance, the words Batu Khan and Vatican are practically the same.
All right, thank you. That's a clear question.
Yes, we know Cal Yuzhny's and Val Yansky's books very well. They came out in recent years and, as sources, they refer to Fomenko, Nesovsky, and Morozov. They really do place the horde and the Mongol Empire not in the east but in the west. The thing is, in this context, citing Nesovsky and Fomenko is not entirely accurate. Strictly speaking, the entire body of evidence presented within the framework of the new chronology consistently rests on the idea that the horde could only have moved from east to west, not the other way around. As for the arguments our viewer just mentioned, well, it depends how you look at it. Fomenko and Nesovsky themselves also point out that the words, orda and orden share the same root. Moreover, there are other examples. Take the well-known Slavic word rada, council, which is of the same root, and so on. In our view, the set of arguments put forward by Cal Yuzhny and Val Yansky doesn't really stand up to serious criticism.
All right, let's continue with Homer. For me it's obvious, and logical, that it's impossible to transmit a work orally for 400 years without introducing any changes. Because even when I tell you something, or you tell me something, we inevitably add something of our own. So, if not like that, then how?
Within the hypothesis of the new chronology, we believe that Homer's works were written in a completely different era, namely, the Middle Ages. In fact, official history acknowledges that before the 15th century, Homer was not known in the Middle Ages. Before him, accounts of the Trojan War penned by Dares Phrygius and Dictys of Crete were in circulation. Today those are unknown to us, because in the Middle Ages, once Homer appeared, these accounts were declared primitive, crude, inaccurate, and we now know almost nothing about them. But Homer is truly the pinnacle of poetic art. Most likely, these texts date back to the 16th century, or at the very earliest, the 15th century.
Did Homer write about what he saw with his own eyes, or was it a recollection of long past times?
If we take into account that, according to our reconstruction of history, the Trojan War was apparently something like the first ancient world war between East and West, which took place mainly in the 13th century and ended in the 14th century, then Homer was writing about past times, but by no means such an ancient history as it might seem.
Let me repeat once again what we've said. Is there a primary source confirming that Homer lived when traditional chronology claims he did?
Naturally, no such source has survived.
Good evening. I enjoy listening to your broadcasts, because I haven't yet gotten around to reading the books. But here's what interested me. In your previous broadcast you said that Latin is a language of the Middle Ages, the 16th and 17th centuries. So, please tell me, what language did Shakespeare, Cervantes, and others write in during the 15th and 16th centuries? Thank you. All the best.
That's a wonderful question. Again, I should make it clear right away that I'm not a philologist, but regarding Shakespeare it must be said the following. Indeed, there arises a very distinct illusion that Shakespeare, in the 15th and 16th centuries, was writing in almost modern English, which is, generally speaking, a little strange. Here we immediately run into the same phenomenon as with the Greek language. There are three English languages too: Old, Middle, and New English. Once again, the very same situation as with the Greek languages. Middle English is very different from the other two. It's almost a completely different language. Whereas the other two, Old and New, are very similar. Apparently, it would be reasonable to assume that what is called Old English was artificially pushed into the past, along with its supposed speakers, that is, along with Shakespeare. But I repeat, unfortunately, I don't have a detailed study on this subject at hand, and I haven't come across one so far. Naturally, we'll share it as soon as such a study appears.
I'd like to summarize the first results of our interactive poll. Please show us the results. In fact, when Andrei asked the question, we really didn't know how people would answer. And yet the majority, 37 people, said they do not understand the events in Yugoslavia.
Far more than those who do understand.
Yes, far more than those who do understand. This is truly a striking result. It shows once again that if we can't understand events even when witnessing them firsthand, we're even less likely to grasp what happened in the past. Let's ask your next question and continue our discussion.
This is a purely pragmatic question and concerns our broadcasts. Dear viewers, did you first learn about Fomenko's theory from Night Flight Show, or did you know about it earlier?
So, if you first heard about the Fomenko's theory from our program, call 828-095-757531. If you already knew about it before, call 828-095-757532. I'll move right on, so as not to waste time. Have any sources older than the ones you've mentioned from the Middle Ages survived? And if so, where are they preserved?
Let me say right away what we've come to in the course of our research. Namely, that there exists a very tangible and concrete threshold of credibility, as we call it among ourselves. That threshold is the 17th century, below which the origins of various sources cannot be reliably traced.
This is very important. Let's repeat it once more. Everything we call primary sources, in fact, only has confirmation as such starting from the 17th century.
Yes, their provenance can reliably be traced back to the 17th century, at most to the very end of the 16th.
We've spoken about the fact that your followers believe Christ was born later than is generally accepted. This raises the question of the Bible. How did the Bible appear? Where did it come from? Are there any primary sources for it?
The situation with the Bible is this. Supposedly, there are ancient manuscripts of the Bible in different languages. Let's take the Greek ones.
How ancient?
For example, it is believed that the three oldest complete manuscripts of the Bible in Greek date back to the 4th century AD. These are the Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus codices. Let's see up to what time their provenance can actually be traced. The Codex Alexandrinus. We know that in 1628 it was presented as a gift to King Charles I. The Codex Vaticanus. It's said to have entered the Vatican in 1475, but its history before that is murky. In fact, it became available to scholars only from 1870 onward. Before that, access to it was restricted to a very narrow circle of people. The Codex Sinaiticus. In the mid-19th century it was discovered by the well-known theologian Constantine von Tischendorf in a waste paper basket at St. Catherine's Monastery. And only on the basis of paleography, that is, comparing handwriting styles, was it concluded that the manuscript belongs to the 4th century AD. In reality, the origins of two of these codices can be traced only as far back as the mid-19th century, and the third to 1628.
And before that?
And before that, we don't know where Cyril Lucaris got the codex that he gave to King Charles I. We simply don't know. That's the threshold of credibility. Roughly speaking, this codex could have been written in 1627.
And do your colleagues in the New Chronology have a version of how the Bible was created at all? When, how, and by whom?
Of course, such a version exists. To understand it, one must turn to the well-known event of the Council of Trent. Traditionally, it is believed that a biblical canon was established back in 362 at the Council of Laodicea. Naturally, no documents from that council, or from other early councils, have survived.
Why is it believed so, and not otherwise?
There is a certain tradition that supposedly it was so. In reality, the biblical canon was officially adopted at the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. But although the canon was formally established at that time, the Bible in the form we know it today, appeared even later. For example, if we take the well-known Orthodox Church Qur'an book, also known as the Books of the Pilate, In its bibliography we find a great many works that are completely unfamiliar to us. For instance, a book called The Genealogies or something referred to as Jesus Semiramin. We simply don't know what these books were. They haven't physically survived. There are many other such works that have not reached us. It turns out that, for example, the Bible in Hebrew was actually first published in 1731 in Crimea. In Greek, the Bible was first published in the early 19th century.
So, am I right in thinking that if a book was published in the 19th or 17th century, it could have had editors, to use our modern term, who revised the events in it as they saw fit?
That, in fact, was the essence of the canonization of the Bible at the Council of Trent in the mid-16th century. Out of a large number of handwritten texts, which naturally differed greatly from one another, the Church Fathers chose those that seemed to them the most correct.
Not necessarily those that were closer to the truth or more realistic, but those they considered more fitting.
Andrei, it's difficult for us now to make such subjective judgments, whether they seemed correct or not. If we had the opportunity to compare them with the original sources from which the selection was made, then we could draw such conclusions consciously. But that's impossible, because those sources have not survived.
I see. Let's take a call.
Good evening. Tell me, please, if Fomenko claims there was no Tatar-Mongol yoke but instead a single united state, then where did the proverb, "An uninvited guest is worse than a Tatar," which has come down to us from the depths of time, come from?
That's an unexpected question. Thank you very much.
Yes, really remarkable.
I'd even say it's the kind of question you'd get on a comedy quiz show.
Wonderful question. And I'll allow myself to give a similar kind of answer, in that same spirit. The point is that the word Tatars simply referred to warriors. The term had nothing to do with any particular nationality.
So, the warriors were simply called that?
Yes, the Tatars were the Cossacks. To be more precise, Tatars or Cossacks were lightly armed cavalry. They often acted as punitive detachments when it came to calling in the Tatars to punish some city. Certain districts, provinces, or regions would periodically refuse to pay tribute, taxes, or comply with some order from the center. Then punitive troops would arrive. Naturally, there was nothing pleasant about someone showing up at your door with a sword, a saber, or a spear, demanding that you comply or pay tribute. That's where such an unflattering proverb could have come from.
So, in fact, the proverb should sound something like, "An uninvited guest is worse than, I don't know, a policeman, worse than a warrior."
A revenue officer.
That's the idea. In other words, it wasn't about ethnicity?
Not at all. It has absolutely nothing to do with the Tatars living today on the Volga, in Crimea, or anywhere else.
I see. Let's go back to talking about primary sources. They say, for instance, this was written by Aristotle, or that was written by Homer. But since all the original sources are lost, they simply don't exist, and everything begins only in the Middle Ages. On what basis are such claims made? Aristotle's Poetics. How do we know it's really his? A play by Aeschylus. What's the basis for that?
Andrei, allow me to take a somewhat broader approach here. First of all, I'd like to focus on historical writings. And since, as we know, history was written primarily as church history, it makes sense to look at church historical sources. On this subject, there's a very interesting study by Professor Bolotov. In his research, he came to the following conclusion. For example, when speaking of ancient Greek and Roman church writers, virtually all scholars and researchers today rely on the edition by Abbot Jacques Mene. This was in the mid-19th century. That's when Mene's famous Patrology was published, which contained nearly 400 volumes. Andrei, just think about it, 400 volumes.
What exactly is Patrology?
Patrology is a collection of the entire body of works, 221 works by Latin writers and, if I remember correctly, 161 by Greek writers. But let's take a look at where Mene actually got his texts. It turns out that Mene himself wasn't really a systematizer. He relied on a single publishing house run by the Benedictine monks, who had been publishing their works in the 17th–18th centuries. And Mene based his edition on theirs. As for what the Benedictines themselves relied on, We simply don't know.
Still, I want to return to the question I asked. What you're telling us is very important and interesting, but I want to understand. We say, the poetry of Aristotle, but in reality, maybe it was written by Joe Schmo.
Most likely, it was written by someone one of whose names, was Aristotle. We just need to understand that Aristotle didn't live in some century BC, but in the Middle Ages. In fact, we've come up with an empirical rule of thumb. Books usually appear around the same time they are written.
Meaning?
Meaning, if some book first surfaced, let's say, in 1654, then most likely it was written not long before that date. That's all. It's simply an empirical observation.
I get that, but what I don't get is, how can you then assert that it was written by Aristotle? How do you know that? There's no original source, is there?
We're forced to follow tradition to some extent, since today there's no real way of establishing what that person's actual name was. It's assumed that these texts were written by someone we conventionally call Aristotle.
So, does that mean that all the books written about Aristotle, about Aeschylus, the enormous amount of research about these people, the vast literature about, say, ancient Greek theater, none of it has any real foundation?
Let's put it this way. Most likely, a significant portion of it is literary invention. Because notice this curious psychological point. We supposedly have preserved the words of Alexander the Great, spoken to his cavalry commander in the 3rd century BC. Yet about kings, dukes, and czars who lived in the 10th–11th centuries, we have only the vaguest notions and recollections. For example, as far as I know, traditional history doesn't even know the exact circumstances or place of Dmitry Donskoy's death.
Why is that?
I'm not sure why, unfortunately, but the fact remains.
You keep posing riddles for which, in reality, you know the answers.
Andrei, within the framework of our historical reconstruction, which I hope we'll talk about in the next talk show, we do have an explanation as to why the place and exact time of Dmitry Donskoy's death cannot be precisely established.
Let's start talking about that now. We'll still have plenty left to discuss.
There is an opinion, let me stress, still more of a hypothesis, that Dmitry Donskoy was killed in the Battle of Kosovo during the famous battle between the Turks and the Serbs, in which, as we well remember, the Turkish Sultan was slain. Nevertheless, the battle was won by the Sultan's son. There is a hypothesis that, in this case, it was in fact Dmitry Donskoy.
So, the one who was thought to be the Turkish Sultan was actually Dmitry Donskoy.
Yes, who at that moment was called the Turkish Sultan. Unfortunately, I don't remember his name.
I think in our next show we'll discuss the idea that Dmitry Donskoy was a Turkish Sultan. That requires a more extended conversation. Please, we have a call.
Good afternoon. I'm well acquainted with the works of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nisovsky. I've studied them carefully. I have one serious question about the chronological axis. For Fomenko and Nisovsky, the chronological axis is the main tool by which all events are arranged. This is true for classical history as well. At the same time, from ordinary high school textbooks we know that the decimal system was created in 1040. That means there couldn't have been 100-year centuries before then. Centuries of 100 years could have arisen only together with the decimal system. So, from 1040 onward there are 100-year centuries, but before that there were other kinds of centuries. The Jewish 60-year system is known, and the Chinese one too. Whether ancient or not, doesn't matter here. If we take 1040 as the year when 60-year centuries transitioned into 100-year centuries, and considering the century-long gap in Russian chronicles, the century of overlap, it turns out that we live at the end of the 20th century but really in the 15th century. And history immediately becomes shorter. Incidentally, in this case the role of Scaliger and Petavius stands out even more sharply, because Scaliger and Petavius were unable to place all the events across all sources.
Thank you very much for the question. I think it's clear, and thank you for showing that we have viewers who think so deeply.
As for the decimal system supposedly being adopted in 1040, I must again ask, who was the first to say that it was adopted in 1040? Most likely, this system of counting was adopted later. When exactly, or at least in which century, I'm not prepared to say right now. As for the role of Scaliger and Petavius, indeed they did not lay out all the events and all the cultures.
Then please tell us, who were Scaliger and Petavius, because perhaps not everyone knows.
They were the two famous medieval theologians and scholars who, broadly speaking, laid the foundations of modern history and chronology, above all, chronology. But let's remember that, strictly speaking, Egyptology was born in the 19th century and only began to acquire a truly serious scientific foundation in the second half of the 19th century. At the same time, Egyptology grew upon a pre-existing chronological framework. It's important to keep in mind that the chronological scale itself was created in the early 17th century, and everything that came afterward was adapted to it. None of the traditional historians ever tried to question it.
Now let's look at the results of our interactive poll. I find them very interesting. People split roughly in half between those who already knew and those who learned from our talk show. That's important to us because people often say that only those already familiar with Fomenko call in. As you see, the results are divided 50-50. And now we have our third question for you. It's very important to us, because people call and ask, would you release videocassettes with recordings of these discussions? We're not sure whether we want to or not. It's possible, but we don't know if you actually need them. So, our question is very simple and practical. Are you willing to buy videocassettes with recordings of the conversations about academician Fomenko's hypothesis? Depending on your answers in the next 15 minutes, we'll decide whether to release them or not. If there are enough interested viewers, then we'll work out how to do it. We have another call, please.
I'm interested in this. Which theory of the Earth's development is preferred in Fomenko's theory? There are creationism and the theory of evolution. Which of the two is given more preference?
Excuse me, don't hang up. I didn't catch the first word. Theory of evolution.
Creationism, meaning the biblical theory of creation.
Creationism.
The question is clear. How did the Earth come into being? Was it created by God, or did some kind of evolution take place? Maybe aliens, I don't know. What does Fomenko think about this? 208 people want to buy the cassette. That's a record number so far, though I can't say it's very big, but we'll see what happens next. Now it's already 211.
Thank you very much, dear viewers, for such results. First of all, it would probably be best to ask Anatoly Fomenko personally what he thinks about the creator.
This is not about faith, but about history.
I understand, but the thing is, what Fomenko, Nosovsky, and all of us, his followers and students deal with, is written history, only written sources. That's it. Only what we can at least somehow trace through documents, try to reconstruct, restore. Perhaps with the partial help of archaeology, but only as supporting material. Everything beyond this field, we don't attempt to judge in principle.
I'd like to thank the person who signed his message, traditionalist Vladimir, who sent us a very interesting letter over the internet. There are a huge number of questions here. Vladimir, Andrei will also reply to you by email, since you included a return address. Thank you for writing to us. But there's one question I'd like to raise here. It concerns the Kyrgyz epic of Manas and epics in general. We've already discussed Homer, whether the Homeric texts could have been passed down orally. In general, that seems unlikely. Does your group have any thoughts about how epics were created? Because the same thing is said about epics, that they were passed down orally. The same Manas was transmitted across several generations. Could that really be the case? And how do you determine the dates when epics like Manas or, for example, the Estonian Kalevala were composed?
Andrei, I must apologize. I personally don't know of any research of this kind at the moment. Naturally, I'll take note of your question and try to find out how this issue is addressed.
As for the epics, we can return to them in the next show.
If possible. I just wouldn't want to speculate right now.
That's fine. Let's hear a viewer's question, please.
Tell me, please, according to Fomenko's theory, when does exact chronology begin? For example, we know our revolution was in 1917, so what about Pushkin? From what point in time?
Katya, today during our show we are talking about the threshold of credibility at the beginning of the 17th century or the second half of the 16th century. We believe that the bulk of events can be consistently interpreted and at the very least dated by this threshold of credibility, that is, the beginning of the 17th century.
I don't want to confuse people now. As I understand it, it's not about saying that the events of ancient Greece didn't happen. It's about them having happened at a different time.
Absolutely. All these events did take place, but they occurred in the Middle Ages and were later given different names and, in part, relocated to other geographical areas.
To make the conversation about primary sources more complete, because I think we didn't explain this very clearly, what happened to them?
The primary sources? They were simply destroyed.
By whom? When? Why?
The political collapse of the empire was a long process, apparently lasting at least several decades. Naturally, during that time there was an intense effort to produce political and historical justifications for the breakup and division of the empire, in order to guard against any possible revival of the empire. This was precisely the period of the Council of Trent, the time of troubles, and the civil war in Russia. At that very moment a mass purge of texts also took place. That is, books were massively withdrawn from circulation, and new ones were written based on them.
We're trying to reason logically, and my question is also based on logic. A primary source back then must have been an extraordinary document. Could it really be that in the Middle Ages, say in Russia, there wasn't even a handful of honest people who wanted to hide and preserve them? Could that really be?
Andrei, first of all, let me give as an example this book by Mavro Urbina. It recounts absolutely fantastic things from the point of view of traditional chronology, battles of the Russians with the Romans, with Julius Caesar, and with ancient Roman emperors. And no less astounding is the bibliography that Mavro Urbina provides. We are basically unfamiliar with 80%, not even of the books, but of the authors he cites. We don't know who he is even talking about.
So, do you realize what you're saying right now? Am I right in understanding that humanity consciously destroyed its genuine history and invented a new one?
I wouldn't tie all of humanity to this process. Apparently, it was just a few thousand people who had the ability to make decisions and carry them out.
But essentially, that is what they were doing.
Of course. The history of the past was deliberately altered, and the very course of history itself went in a completely different direction. If earlier our civilization had developed within the framework of a single giant state, which generally made it possible to balance cultural, economic, religious, and other levels without particularly severe racial, national, or religious conflicts, then after the collapse of that state, political, governmental, religious, and national barriers arose. We see that from that moment up to the present day, with only short breaks, Europe has been at war almost continuously. That is what really happened. And that is how we see this problem.
I would like to summarize the results of our interactive poll. I can't give the exact account right now, but I believe this is simply one of the records. 276 people are ready to buy the tapes. I think this number should be multiplied by at least 3, because typically a purchase is for a family. Let's assume, on average, 3 people per family. That means this is the number of people who are ready to have our conversations at home, to keep Fomenko's theory at home. Thank you very much. This is truly important. Now we will think about it and let you know how we will be releasing these tapes, how we will be selling them, and how this will all work. As I understand it, 13 people spoke against it. They don't want to buy them and express their protest that way. That's not a very large number, but thank you too. We have 3 minutes left. There's time for one more call.
Good evening. I've already heard you say that you only deal with the written history of humanity. But still, the question arises. What about the Neolithic, the Mesolithic, the Paleolithic? It turns out that matter developed in just a flash. Where is the rest of history? I understand that you don't cover that.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have not only never denied the Neolithic, Mesolithic, Paleolithic, and so on, but we haven't even touched them. We simply haven't studied them, since we don't have the tools required to study those eras. That is the work of other specialists. And that all these stages of human development undoubtedly existed, is confirmed, for example, by archaeology. There are flint knives, axes, polished mammoth teeth, fire pits, human dwellings, cave paintings, and so on. It's just that, at the moment, this does not fall within the scope of our scientific interest.
I can only thank you. First, thank all those who call and write to us. Please keep writing. Everything that comes by email, mail, or fax is passed on to Andrei Vladimirovich. He will answer many of you personally, and some questions he will answer in our future broadcasts. Thank you very much for joining us. On that note, I, your host Andrei Maksimov, say goodbye. All the best. Thank you.